Hello and welcome to the GD Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk. Do moderate candidates do better in elections? It's a question that has rocked the online world of election data nerds in recent days. There's been hair pulling, locker stuffing, swirly giving. Sorry, I read that wrong. There has been online snark, Substack posts and replies, competing Twitter and Blue Sky threads, academic credential waving, and accusations of bias. What started this whole thing is a little metric called WAR, which is oftentimes used in sports and means wins above replacement. Basically, how well does a particular politician perform in an election compared to how a generic candidate from their own party would have done? The folks at Split Ticket, helmed by Lakshya Jain, have been using this metric to analyze electoral politics for a while and have found that the benefit to being a moderate is notable. From 2018 to 2024, according to their data, Blue Dog Democrats did about 5 percentage points better than progressive Democrats in House elections. The folks at Strength in Numbers, helmed by Elliott recently published their own version of WAR, showing a smaller benefit to political moderation, about a 1 to 1.5 percentage point benefit, with significant uncertainty bands around those numbers. Elliott concluded in an article that moderation is overrated in electoral politics. This initial disagreement sparked a broader debate between other Substackers, academics, and election wonks who took one side or another. Today, for the first time since this debate began, the two sides are sitting down together to hash it out here on the GD Politics Podcast. With me is Elliott Morris of Strength in Numbers and a former colleague of mine. Welcome to the podcast, Elliott.
Hey, what's up, Galen?
Also here with us is Lakshya Jain, the director of political data at The Argument, which is the new home as of this week for Split Ticket. Lakshya, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have both of you, and I just want to lay out some ground rules before we begin so we're all on the same page. First of all, you are allowed to swear, maybe even encouraged to swear if it moves you. There you go. While this will likely get wonky where possible, please try to explain yourself in plain language. And lastly, if you are going to be mean, please also be funny. Although I assume that both of you will, well, you model many things. I assume you will also model civil disagreement just perfectly. Are there any other stipulations that either of you would like to make before we begin?
No, I like these ground rules. These are good.
Okay. I like these.
Right. Fabulous. Okay. So let's start with laying out the stakes. Why do we care about the answer to this question? The value of moderation, this wins above replacement metric in general, and maybe if you want to elaborate, are you coming to this question from the perspective of it's worthwhile to try to elect Democrats? It's more of an academic exercise. Do you want to elect Republicans? Do you want to elect a certain type of Democrat or Republican? Is this just a good governance argument? I guess, Lakshya, let's start with you, and you can lay out the stakes as you see them, and then Elliott will go to you.
You know, I think that the importance of the debate on does moderation matter really matters because there are a lot of people within the Democratic Party trying to chart out a future for a party that I think is probably at its nadir in the last 20, 30 years at minimum. And whether or not being moderate helps in elections is of immense consequence in deciding who to nominate, what rhetoric to take, what policy platforms to push, and everything related under the sun. And so, whether the party says, no, moderation is important, we need a big tent, let's encourage all of these different people to run, and let's also see if we can get closer to the median voter to try and win more votes, is meaningfully, I think, an important question to consider because at the end of the day, elections are really close nowadays. And a difference of 1% to 2% is the difference between Kamala Harris being president and Donald Trump.
Okay. Elliott?
Yeah, I think we agree on the stakes, right? Like Lakshya and I are both coming at this from a center-left point of view. I think we both want Democrats broadly to win elections. We think that liberal democracy is good and that one side of the aisle is bad at preserving liberal democracy. So I think we can agree on the stakes. I would, maybe come from a different angle here. At Strength in Numbers, it's a collaborative WAR estimate that we launched. So I'm going to be saying we. We in this case includes myself and Mark Rika, who made the model for our WAR. He needs credit, so I'm giving that to him. And we made our WAR estimate not because we wanted to enter the fray of the moderation wars, which is I guess we're here now.
Well,
anyway.
here you are, Elliott.
but because like for entirely different reasons, and that was Split Ticket has a good history of point estimates for their war, but we thought that we should introduce a quantification of uncertainty into the argument. So the only reason we ever really published this was because we wanted to put out a public, open source, transparent model that said, not here's the value of moderation, but here's what you can do with that information. Here's how much weight you can put on these conclusions from the Bayesian statistical point of view. Like, elections are really complex. There's lots of reasons that elections might be close. Here's one reason why it might be close, and then people can take that information and then very importantly, our uncertainty about how skilled politicians are, which is huge, by the way. The uncertainty is giant, and then do what they will with that information. So I think that's some necessary context, at least from our point of view, and I think Mark deserves that context.
All right, I'm going to ask you to explain more how you modeled this in a second, but I just want to double check with you, Lakshya, first. Elliott described the stakes for the both of you as coming from a center-left position, wanting Democrats to get elected. Would you agree that that's sort of where your position in all of this is?
Yeah, I mean, I think to be clear, Split Ticket is actually nonpartisan. We have Republicans on as well as Democrats. So our motivation in making the model was not just what helps Democrats win elections. My motivation in talking about it as extensively as I have is because I think understanding voter behavior is important. I am personally a Democrat. I want Democrats to understand this, but the motivation behind the model was actually primarily just to understand what wins elections on both sides. And hopefully, selfishly, I was hoping maybe Democrats would want to pay attention to that and look at it, but that wasn't a motivation behind making the model.
Okay, so let's get into making the model. You created yours first, Lakshya, so let's start with you. Can you explain what you did and ultimately what you found?
Yeah. So there are a few things that people use to evaluate overperformance in general. When you're trying to evaluate whether a congressional candidate did better or worse than you would expect, people like to see, how much did you overperform the president by? Now, the problem is that there are a few structural things that cause this overperformance across the board. Regardless of who you are or what you do, we tend to notice certain boosts. So, for example, incumbents do better. This is well established in the political science literature that incumbents generally do better. Andrew Gelman has studied it. There's a lot of papers on it, so I won't rehash the literature, but generally, if you're an incumbent, you tend to do about 3 to 4% better in an election than if you're running in an open seat. So, right off the top of the bat, looking at whether or not someone did better or worse than Harris is slightly misleading because you haven't controlled for the fact that if they're an incumbent, they're actually just likely to do better simply because of the fact that voters don't like changing things up as much as people say they do. And this is an effect we've seen for decades. It's declined in importance, but it's still there. The second thing that we control for is this concept of lagged partisanship, which you can think of as like a realignment type of variable almost. It's a bit simplistic to call it that, but I think it'll get the point across to the non-wonky audiences. Here's what that really means. Not all Trump voters are created equal when you consider their probability of voting for the Democrat. Not all Harris voters are created equal when you consider their probability for voting for the Republican. It's not true that every Harris voter is going to vote for the Democrat down ballot and that their odds of voting Republican are 0%. It's not true that every Trump voter in 24 is voting Republican down the ballot. Their odds of voting for the Democrat are 0%. Here's why. If you voted for Donald Trump in 2016, 2020, and 2024, you think of yourself as a Republican. You are going to vote for Republicans up and down the ballot. But if you voted for Joe Biden in 2020, and then you voted for Donald Trump in 2024, you're actually more likely to consider yourself either a swing voter or really a Democrat for Trump. You think, hey, I'm a Democrat, but I kind of like Donald Trump. I don't like my own party's nominee, but I'm a Democrat. I'm going to vote for Henry Cuellar down ballot. I'm going to vote for AOC down ballot. I'm going to vote for Richie Torres because I know who these people are. I'm going to vote for them, but I'm voting for Trump. It turns out that whether or not you voted for the Democrat in 2020 is a very strong predictor of whether you're going to vote for the Democrat congressional nominee in 2024. And so we control for this by saying, if you're in a district that has a lot of these ancestral Democrats, these new Trump voters, you should be doing better than Kamala Harris to begin with, because you have a lot more Democrats in your district, even if those Democrats recently started voting for Trump. And we control for that as well as incumbency. And that, along with like a couple of other minor factors, which are small enough to where I won't get into them today, on their demographics and spending, but they're very minor. But those are the two big things we control for in evaluating how well did someone really do relative to the presidential race and what was their overperformance.
Right. And so can you give us an example of somebody who overperforms or underperforms according to this metric?
Yeah, sure. You know, people like Jared Golden, you already know they're strong candidates. Our model says they're strong candidates. Our model says Jared Golden did 6 points above replacement compared to a replacement level incumbent in Maine second. Our model says that, someone like Adam Gray did 5% better than replacement in margin over a challenger to John Duarte, over a replacement level challenger to Republican incumbent John Duarte. But our model says some things that people may find counterintuitive. For example, our model says that both AOC and Richie Torres were war underperformers despite outrunning Kamala Harris by 7% and 8% respectively. This is because both of their districts are two of the most rightward trending districts in the entire country. They swung right from 2016 by over 30 points. They swung right from 2020 by over 20 points. And so what happens is our model says, hey, hang on, you're incumbents here and you're in a super down ballot Democrat district. You should be outrunning Kamala Harris by much more than 6 or 7%. You're 1 point underperformers or something like that. And that's an example of what our model says, where it controls for those factors. And it says, actually, after looking at these factors, your overperformance wasn't as impressive as you think it was.
Got it. Okay. So, and the conclusion of this model is that when you compare the progressive caucus, so self-identified progressives in the House, with self-identified moderates, so blue dog Democrats, those blue dog Democrats do about 5 percentage points better than the progressives. Okay. Elliott, your turn. How did you calculate war? How did you do things maybe differently in particular in trying to figure out whether moderation is valuable?
Sure. So the way that our model works is going to be different than the way that Lakshya's models work. Lakshya tries to predict the difference between a House candidate's performance in a given year, like 2024, and the president's performance in that year. And I think that the variables he picks are good. They're straightforward. They're founded in political science. They make sense in the findings in the context of that choice, the explanation of the difference between a House candidate and a presidential candidate's share of the vote or margin of victory, right? Conclusions from that make sense. But we're trying to predict something different. The strength in numbers model tries to predict the Democratic share or margin of the vote in an election, say 2024, with predictors that we know ahead of time. And we can measure before the impact of the election are known. So that's stuff like the traditional Democratic lean in a district in the presidential election, specifically the past 2 cycles. Stuff like the demographics of a seat, so like what share of it is Hispanic or Black, what's the average income, how old is it, and a couple of other factors specific to the election that we update over time. So that's stuff like whether or not a candidate is experienced or not, if they've held elected office before, if they're an incumbent, if their challenger is an incumbent or inexperienced. And very importantly in our model, the share of the individual contributions for that whole district that are going to the Democratic candidate. We think that's a really strong signal. So this is very similar to the way that 538 and other predictive models for elections, actual election forecasts work. And now we're trying to design a model that predicts Democratic vote share. And the reason this is important to us is because in our war metric, we're not trying to explain the difference between a president and a House candidate. We're trying to explain the difference between a House candidate and a true replacement level House candidate. So we want to be able to make those predictions with the correlation between all these variables and the actual election result for the House candidate in those districts, for the candidate who actually won, and for some hypothetical replacement candidate. And the math on how you establish the hypothetical replacement, maybe we can get into. But for now, I think this big difference I've laid out is the big one in terms of the outcome variable, the thing we're trying to predict. There's just one more thing, though, which is that our model is fully Bayesian. We wrote this model in a programming language called Stan, And this is important to us because what this model does is it treats the parameters as uncertain. So when our model says the past presidential election is worth, 1 percentage point of vote share for every 1 percentage point of difference in the House, or the lagged presidential election, maybe for the next election, it'll be only worth 0.9 or 0.95, or maybe it's worth even more. Maybe the relationship between how black a district is and the outcome in that district changes over time. And we just wanted to be like very, very careful about the certainty that we're making our claims with. So that's another big difference in how the models actually run.
And so this ultimately gets you to a place where being a moderate is worth a point to a point and a half better than being a replacement level candidate, and about 2 to 2.5 points better than being, like a far left progressive squad member or the likes, right?
Yeah, and this is the first point where you see some differences prop up. I would expect that in districts with more moderates, so those are districts around 50-50 in typical presidential elections, that voters in those districts would be more willing to vote for a moderate Democratic House candidate than a liberal presidential candidate, such as Kamala Harris. And so I expect that that's why our estimate for the returns to moderation is lower, because we're not trying to explain the difference between moderate candidates at the House level and liberal candidates, including, Joe Biden was perceived as pretty liberal by the voters too. Not as liberal as Kamala Harris, but more liberal than the average Democratic presidential candidate. The difference between that and predicting the traditional Democratic candidate that might win from that district is probably always going to be a bit more moderate. I think that's what's going on under the hood.
I have some follow-up questions for both of you, but I want to take a step back for a second. Lakshya, I assume that you have some disagreements with this process. Talk about it.
Yeah, I think the biggest disagreement I have is that Elliott doesn't consider the presidential vote of 2024 in actually evaluating over or underperformance. And to me, that is really critical